The book of Romans is an essential one for the Christian life. They're all essential, but oftentimes we start in the book of Romans. And oftentimes when we're going to share the gospel with someone, we start in the book of Romans. It's called the Romans Road, right, is the common gospel presentation method and the common gospel tract that I'm sure you all have seen or heard of. And the book of Romans really is about the gospel. And so it's been a great place to read and to study and to teach and to preach from, to make this our emphasis in the new church there in Dearborn. I think this book is especially applicable in our modern day and to our unique circumstances. We, like you here, find ourselves in the middle of a large urban area, a large metro area. The Apostle Paul here had a desire to go to Rome and preach the gospel there, Rome at that time being the capital of the world. It was the greatest city that the world had ever seen. It kind of engineered and was the first real mega city. And the Apostle Paul wanted to go there and saw the great need for the gospel in that city. It was a city that was advanced in its technologies, advanced in its culture, advanced in its civilization, advanced in its power, yet it was also quite advanced in its wickedness and its sinfulness and its darkness. And those things somewhat kind of tend to go together, do they not? This was a culture that was not welcoming to Christianity, and yet in spite of everything going against them, this is the incredible thing, a church had been established in the city of Rome. This is incredible, and this is even before the apostle had gotten there. He's writing this letter saying, I've been wanting to come, I've been wanting to preach the gospel there, but I'm hearing all these great things that there's already a church and the gospel's already advancing, and that people are being saved, and that the news of that had spread so far. And the church was thriving. The intro to this letter is I feel very applicable even to our situation here tonight. The Apostle Paul was so thankful for those that had believed in that city, and so thankful to hear about the great reports of that church. And I can speak as an outsider that this is a church that has a reputation that I had heard of. I had heard of this church, and I had heard of the wonderful things that God had done here and some of the miracles that this church has experienced. And I was excited to hear, even from a distance, of people being saved and a church growing in the Bay Area of all places. And it's an exciting thing to hear about. And that's the kind of excitement that the Apostle Paul had, to hear about this church. And when he heard about it, he had desire to come and to visit them because their faith had been spoken of throughout the whole world. Is it possible for the work of God and one church in one city to have a reputation that reaches all around the whole world? It was true in that day. It's even more true today. And the apostle desired to come to them and visit them, to bless them and to be blessed by them. Now, the Apostle Paul said he had a gift to impart to them. I don't know if I have that much to impart to you tonight, but what I notice here is the apostle wanted to come bless them, but he wanted to go there to be blessed by them. And Christian fellowship is mutually beneficial. And I can say, I hope that I'm a blessing to you tonight, and I hope it's encouraging to hear about the work that's going on in Dearborn. But let me tell you, I've already been encouraged to be here and to see and hear about the work that's going on here. And I'm blessed by each other's presence. This is why gathering is essential part of the Christian life, because we bless each other by each other's presence. And it's encouraging to see and to hear and to talk and to hear about the things that God is doing in the life of another person. Christians bless each other by their presence and their fellowship, and the apostle desired to go there and to spend this time with them. Christians bless each other by prayer for each other. He says in verse 9, God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers. The apostle believed in prayer. Though he couldn't be with them in person, he could be with them in prayer. And I know this is a church that loves and supports missionaries and prays for missionaries. I just sat and heard your pastor lead you all in praying for missionaries and praying for their needs. Oh, that is essential. We absolutely need prayer. I attribute the successes that we've seen in Dearborn to the prayers of a lot of saints all around the country that have faithfully prayed for us. Whenever somebody calls and says, hey, we're praying for you, I say, I believe you, because we're seeing the fruit. We're seeing things happen. And I know it's not because of me. God is working. And he works as a result of the prayers of his people. We desire your prayers for the work in Dearborn. But what the Apostle Paul, his presence would have been a blessing. And he wanted to go there and bless them with his presence and with his preaching. And his prayers certainly were a great blessing to them. But what was the great need of this city? What was the apostle's great desire beyond all these other blessings and all these other things that would have been good and beneficial to them? He says it in verse 15, he says, as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. You see, this church in the big city, they needed the gospel. They needed the gospel, and they needed it preached to them. Preaching is the method that God has ordained to take this message to the whole world. And the apostle desired greatly to preach that message to them. Every church in the world is in need of the preaching of the gospel. I feel like, now that I'm preaching regularly and weekly in the church, I feel like I'm preaching the same thing every week because it's always going back to the gospel. But that's what we need, and the apostle realized that's what this church needed. They needed to hear the gospel. They needed the power of the gospel. They needed to be confident in the gospel. That's what he wanted to focus on. Every church is in need of the gospel. Every city in the world is in need of the preaching of the gospel. We can look at the great wickedness in the world, and in the rest of Romans chapter 1, that's what the apostle does. He lays out the great wickedness that is present and the state of human depravity in the world. And the answer to the great darkness that we see is the preaching of the gospel. Yet there are many cities, and unfortunately many churches, where the preaching of the gospel is absent, or the preaching of the gospel is so faint that it cannot be heard over the noise of society and culture and all of the other voices that are crying out for people's attention. Populations are rising all around the world. Cities are growing all around the world. The need for the gospel is increasing every moment, every day, as the population of the world grows. Our church planting and our church reproduction and our church growth is not keeping up with the demand. It's estimated that the global population, when the Great Commission was given, was only around 300 to 400 million. Today, that's roughly the population of the United States. Global population just this fall, I think in November, surpassed 8 billion people. The world has grown. The need has grown. There is an incredible need for the preaching of the gospel all around the world. Of those 8 billion people in the world, a quarter of them, 2 billion, are Muslim. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, and it's spreading rapidly in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. In that number, there are 1 billion Roman Catholics. There are over 1 billion Hindus. There are over 1 billion atheists. Millions of people that are worshiping spirits and ancestors. The need for the gospel has never been greater. At the same time that these populations are rapidly rising, there's another trend in our world that is, I think, aggravating, increasing this need for gospel preaching churches and for church planting, and that is the urbanization of the world. As the world is growing, the cities are the ones that are receiving that growth. Globally, almost 180,000 people are moving into cities every day. That's 5.5 million people a month. If you think of it, that's the San Francisco Bay Area being recreated every 30 days. And it's these city centers, these population masses. This is what the Apostle Paul looked at and said, I've got to go there. I got to go preach the gospel there. There are people there that need to hear. There's incredible potential for the spread of the gospel around the world in the planting of churches and the preaching of the gospel in our cities. The Apostle Paul favored city churches as an effective gospel-saturating method. All of his ministry, he bounced city to city. And he saw Rome as his ultimate goal. And once he got there, he kind of stayed there. That was where he finished it off. Because he had made it. He had reached that pinnacle, that big city, that goal that the Lord had set in front of him. His desire to preach the gospel at Rome was an evidence of his belief in the power of the gospel. He shares this desire to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome. And it's a great goal, it's a great desire. But he shares here his motivation, and I believe his desire for those that were already there. In the next verse, when he states in verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believeth." See, Paul was not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel being the story of God, That's the words, one of those old English Anglo-Saxon words, the Godspell. It's the story that God has been writing, the story of redemption. It's the story of John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Specifically, it's the story of the life, the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he said of that story, I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of this. See, shame is a very powerful force in our lives. And the world deals in shame. The world peddles shame. Cancel culture that we're all so acquainted with is the attempt to shame people into conformity, shame people out of their closely held beliefs. Our education system is saturated with critical race theory that attempts to make people feel shame for their own ethnicity, their own history, their own culture, their own nationalities. Gender theory is designed to make people ashamed of their own bodies and their own identity and their own self, uncertain even of who they are. The Bible and God doesn't deal in shame, but the world will attempt to shame you for your Christian beliefs. And it has many methods of doing this, many pressures to make you feel ashamed of the gospel, ashamed to be a Christian. They will accuse you of being outdated, accuse you of believing something that is foolish, accuse you of being on the wrong side of history. That one's my favorite. I believe those are all very weak and foolish arguments. Pay no heed to those accusations. We need to worry less about being on the wrong side of history and worry about being on the wrong side of eternity. Worry about being on the wrong side of a just God who's angry with sin. That is the great fear that we should have. Not a fear of man, but a fear of God. And a fear of God ought to lead us to be unashamed of the gospel like the apostle was. He was not ashamed of this. There are two great dangers in being ashamed of the gospel. If you're ashamed of the gospel, the first great danger is that of abandoning your faith. Shame will lead someone to walk away and wash their hands of it. It's too much pressure, too much shame. They're too afraid. There's a modern movement today that's been called deconstructionism. And we're seeing people of all ages, all across the country, walk away from their faith. That's the result of being ashamed of the gospel, ashamed of God. But there's another danger in being ashamed of your faith, and that is not just in walking away from it, but in suppressing it and hiding it, in becoming a private Christian and keeping it to yourself. Maybe even coming to church, but not being a Christian outside the doors and property of the church. Not being a Christian in your workplace. Not being a Christian to your family. Not being a Christian out in the public square and on social media. Not owning your faith. Both of these are great dangers, and neither of these are valid options if we are going to reach the world with the gospel. The Apostle Paul saw this church in this big city. They had a lot of work cut out for him. He wanted to come preach the gospel for him, but he realized that they needed to get where he was. They needed to not be ashamed of the gospel. And he shares with them this great motive. Both of these results are deadly to Christians and deadly to churches. We must not be ashamed of the gospel because the world is unashamed of their sinfulness. The apostle lays out this reality. For sake of time, I won't read through the rest of the chapter, but the apostle summarizes the worldliness of the world, or the sinfulness or depravity, whatever we would call it, in two big categories. That of ungodliness. The world is ungodly, meaning things, they have rejected God. And they try to create and live a life without God. And try to create morals and try to explain existence and do all of these things without God. And the result of ungodliness is ungodly lifestyles, ungodly worship, worshiping things that are not God, and ungodly and unnatural affections. He explains it in vivid detail in Romans chapter 1. Sounds a lot like America. Sounds a lot like our cities that have gone these ungodly directions. He describes it as unrighteousness, that which is against God's law, that which is not right. If we're going to be unashamed of the gospel, we must be unashamed and unafraid to draw the lines where God has drawn the lines and call sin, sin. And Romans 1 does that quite clearly. He has a big long list of unrighteousness, sins, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affections, implacable, unable to be satisfied, unmerciful. Yet what does he give at the end of this list? Look with me in chapter 1, verse 32. This ungodly, unrighteous world, who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. You see, this world is unashamed of its ungodliness, unashamed of its unrighteousness. Ungodliness and unrighteousness is celebrated, is legislated, is paraded, and promoted, and protected all around this country without shame. And they are quite eager, and they're quite energetic, and they're quite enthusiastic in their promotion of ungodliness and in their promotion of unrighteousness. If we stand a chance to make a difference in this world, we can't be ashamed of the gospel. We must be as equally bold and equally confident in our side and in our cause and in our God as the Apostle Paul was. We must be unashamed of the gospel. We must be unashamed of the gospel. Why? Well, because it's powerful. Why was the apostle? He said, I'm unashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God. The gospel is powerful. It's packaged power, and it has the power to change lives. I'm so encouraged just to talk with your pastor and hear the stories even of so many of you coming to Christ, and that is what gives us confidence in the gospel, because it works. You can be confident in the gospel because it worked in your life, and it overcame your sinfulness, and it overcame your unbelief. If it worked for you, it'll work for somebody else. We can be confident in the gospel because of its power. It has the power to reach all of those people mentioned in Romans chapter 1. No one is ashamed of a winning team. I've been driving around and flying over here. You know what I saw a whole lot of? Golden State Warriors shirts, hats, shorts, everything. Warriors fans everywhere. Why is that? They're not ashamed, right? They're not ashamed. The Warriors have been the best team for the last 10 years, and they're confident in that. I didn't see many Oakland A's jerseys or hats. Just an observation, all right? I'm a Detroit Lions fan, so I can say these things. Nobody's ashamed to be the fan of a winning team, of a powerful team. When it comes to our God and it comes to our church, we're on a winning team. We're on a powerful team. The gospel is the power of God. We ought not be ashamed of it. It works and it wins everywhere that it is tried. We can be unashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God. We can be unashamed of the gospel because it is unto salvation. It has this incredible goal in its power. It has this incredible result of its power. That is the salvation of souls. You know, the gospel is the only thing that can do that. It's the only thing that has that power. It's the only thing that can pass someone from death to life. It's the only thing that can resurrect a human soul from death unto life. It's the only method whereby souls can be saved. We just celebrated just this last month the first salvation in our church by a young woman out of Islam. And let me tell you, it was powerful. It's powerful. And God did it. God did it. God did it in an amazing, incredible way. This young lady started coming to our church in December in full burqa, robes, hair covered, and attended that way for a month. And every week we'd share the gospel, and preach the gospel, and give her books, and give her a Bible, and slowly we just watched those walls break down. And you know what? We had been told that Dearborn is where church planters go to die. I've been told that. We had been told that evangelism in Dearborn is like plowing on a rock. Very encouraging words to hear to a church planter. But you know what we've seen? With men, these things are impossible. But with God, all things are possible. We can be unashamed of the gospel because it is to everyone that believeth. I might have room to be ashamed of an exclusive gospel that was just for me and not for somebody else. I might have room to be ashamed of a gospel who left some people out. I might be ashamed of a gospel that was ineffective for one group of people. But that's not the gospel that we have. We don't have to be ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God in salvation to everyone. Everyone. He says to the Jew and the Greek. It works for the religious person and the non-religious person. It works for the Muslim and it works for the atheist. It works for the fundamentalist. It works for the skeptic. It works for the superstitious. It works for the scientific. It works for the self-righteous and the unrighteous. It's the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. The same gospel works for everyone. Amen. We don't need a different gospel in Detroit and in Dearborn than in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. It's the same gospel. We don't need a different gospel in 2023 than the gospel that they needed in 23 AD. It's the same gospel. It still works. We don't need a different gospel for a Muslim person than we need for an atheistic person or an agnostic person. It's the same gospel, and it still works. We must be unashamed of the gospel. To be unashamed of the gospel means that you are sure of the gospel. Do you believe it? You can't be unashamed of a gospel you yourself do not possess. You yourself have not believed. Do you believe it? Or do you still have doubts? Because if you have doubts, you're not unashamed and you're not going to be effective in sharing that gospel with another person. You can't take someone somewhere that you haven't been yourself. You can't bring someone else past something that you yourself are still unsure of and afraid of. If you have doubts, if you're not sure, settle those doubts. Be sure. Be confident. Unashamed means sure. Unashamed means confident. Why be ashamed of something that's incredibly effective? Why be ashamed of something that's incredibly efficient? Why be ashamed of something that is incredibly essential? Absolutely necessary for every person. An unashamed Christian is one that owns the gospel for themselves. An unashamed person preaches the gospel. An unashamed Christian lives the gospel. This is the church that Rome needed. This is the church that America needs. This is the church that every city in the world needs, an unashamed church. And an unashamed church is made up of unashamed Christians. The world cannot afford a weak church. This community cannot afford a timid church. It's not going to cut it. This world needs an unashamed church. The church needs to live. The church needs to multiply, and it will do that if its members are unashamed of the gospel. It will do that if it preaches the gospel. That was what the apostle desired to do. It's what we desire for Dearborn, and it's what God still desires for the whole world. And there are millions who still do not have access to the preaching of the gospel. How will they hear without a preacher? And how will they preach except they be sent? And where are they going to be sent from? If not from here. If not from our churches. This is the environment. This is the place where we reach the world.